nation formed by that desire for independence. However, this mindset seems to result in many Americans' dislike for government and preference for some other kind of institution that has more to do with the individual and representation of that. We have, and always have had, one of the most democratic countries in the world, but people are still not satisfied. Everyone just wants more freedom. From the very beginning, as the soon-to-be Americans were fighting to end the connection to Britain and King George III, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, which showed Americans why this separation was so necessary. The reliance on Britain was useless because it caused America more hurt than help. At this point in time, early 1776, the power of governing was still in the king's hands, who wasn't showing any signs of compromising, so there was no other choice but to cut the cord. Not to mention that the physical distance in itself would make it nearly impossible to maintain any connection to the king. Paine states that because of the location of Britain in Europe, in which many wars were bound to break out, the U.S. would inevitably be drawn into unnecessary feuds and would lose potential alliances with other European nations. While many people were afraid that a civil war would occur in this new independent nation, they had more to fear staying in a government with a poor connection to the people. Paine's rationalization of the realities of Britain and King George were clearly good enough points to bring the Americans to defeat the British during the American Revolution. This whole defiance of the government is just the beginning for America. Rebelling seems to be a common theme in our history, and that strive for independence occurs frequently. Another point in time when the government was limited in order to allow for more individual freedom was during the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1799, which led to the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions, two documents written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they limited the power of the national government and allowed for state government to have more control. They believed that state government was greater than national government because of its deeper recognition of the individual. Jefferson and Madison stated in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions that national government was under the power of the state government and that there's a specific limit on what the national government can and can't do, and, like it says in the Declaration of Independence, if they exceed this limit in some illegal way, states have the right to, quote-unquote, arrest the progress of the evil. The reason that it is necessary for state government to be superior to national is because it is impossible for them to judge their own infractions. It is up to the state government to refine them. In this particular situation, it is the state government that is acting on the behalf of the individual person, but it still represents the American citizens' need to limit the control of others over themselves. Henry David Thoreau has an extremist position about government of any form in his essay Civil Disobedience, where he prides himself on being incredibly against it. His argument in the writing is that a nation is not about the government but the people, and that the authority just suppresses the people's ideas. At one point, he writes that we should be people first and subjects afterwards, and that the law puts restrictions on people's conscience and abilities, and that to submit to the law makes men mindless subjects being controlled by a higher power. The writing is all about being above the government and being above that higher power. He believes that is the only way for the nation to be fair and just. It encourages people to break the law and rebel, like in Paine's Common Sense, in a situation where abiding would make them an quote-unquote agent of injustice. However, Thoreau does point out that the Constitution has aspects that are admirable. He even goes as far to say that government isn't all bad when it is being completely run based off the consent of the government, and is so that there is no federal hold over person or property. In his ideal nation, a complete democracy would be in place where the individual is recognized as the highest power. This is very understandable, and it just goes to show that all these points in history, the people arguing against the government aren't just trying to be difficult, but rather they are just looking for the best interest of the nation and of the American people. Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth has a similar idea, but in terms of money and in a financial sense rather than in terms of government control. He is all about being self-sufficient and managing money on your own terms to prevent unnecessary government taxation. In an excerpt from the essay, Carnegie talks specifically about what happens to a person's wealth when they die. Basically, there are two things that can happen with a large sum of someone's money when they are deceased. It can go to the next generation, which wouldn't allow them to be independent at all, or the government can tax it, in which case they would become more superior. Carnegie believes these both to be bad financial moves. Ideally, a person should try to use all their money while they are still living, and that saving it, to a certain extent, ends up being a waste in the end. His advice is for the proprietor to keep the management of the wealth in their own hands by distributing portions of it equally throughout society. In this way, the economy becomes more just and essentially gets rid of unequal distribution of wealth. Without the death tax of government or the greed that comes with inheritance, this theory is a good replacement for the idea of communism, and it expresses individualism as well as the team effort of a nation represented through the sharing of wealth. Andrew Carnegie's desire is to provide people with a fair and equal economy without interference of government. Essentially, he's putting the nation's economy into his own hands, which just proves that what has been said so far, that Americans prefer prosperity of the people to government control. Americans are people driven to independence and have pride in the voice of the individual. Ever since the start of America, beginning with the rebellion against King George III, through the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions where state government was proven to be superior to federal, and in 1849 when civil disobedience was written, and during the period of industrialization when gospel of wealth, and even to this day, defiance to the government has been a recurring theme throughout our nation's history. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, seeing as the people make sure to prevent a completely controlling government, and with that comes a true democracy. Americans know how to keep the government balanced, and when to take matters into their own hands. It is a proud feeling to belong to this nation of individualists, and nowhere else in the world do people have freedom like here in the United States of America.